On the evening of September 5th, 1945, at approximately 7:15 p.m., a 26-year-old cipher clerk named Igor Sergeyevich Gouzenko walked out of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, Canada, with 109 classified documents concealed beneath his shirt. The documents, many of them marked with the highest levels of Soviet classification, detailed an extensive espionage network operating throughout North America. Gouzenko, who had worked in the embassy's cipher section for more than 2 years, had spent the previous 3 days methodically selecting and removing documents that he believed would prove the existence of Soviet intelligence operations targeting Canada, the United States, and Great Britain. His defection, and the documents he brought with him, would become one of the foundational events of the Cold War, the first major breach in Soviet intelligence operations in the West, and the beginning of decades of suspicion, paranoia, and systematic counterintelligence efforts that would reshape Western security services. Before we continue with how a desperate family spent days trying to convince anyone to listen, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We document these pivotal Cold War intelligence cases every week, bringing you the verified truth behind operations that changed history. Now, let's return to 1919 and understand who Igor Gouzenko really was. Igor Gouzenko had been born on January 26, 1919, in the village of Rogachevo, in the Moscow region of Russia. His early life coincided with the consolidation of Soviet power following the Russian Revolution and Civil War. According to biographical information compiled by Canadian intelligence services after his defection, Gouzenko's family had been relatively fortunate during the turbulent 1920s and 1930s. His father worked as an administrator in a local collective farm, a position that provided modest stability during periods of famine and political upheaval. Igor had shown academic aptitude from an early age, particularly in mathematics and languages, and had been selected for advanced education at the Moscow Architectural Institute, where he studied from 1937 to 1941. In 1941, shortly after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Gouzenko's education had been interrupted by military service. However, rather than being sent to the front lines, he had been assigned to the Intelligence Directorate of the Red Army, specifically to work in cipher and communications. This assignment reflected both his mathematical abilities and the Soviet system's practice of identifying and channeling talented individuals into positions where they could serve state interests most effectively. Gouzenko received training in cryptography, cipher systems, and communications protocols. By 1943, he had been transferred to the main intelligence directorate of the Red Army, known by its Russian acronym GRU, and assigned to work in the cipher section. In 1942, Gouzenko had married Anna Kuzminichna, a woman 3 years his senior who worked as a laboratory technician in Moscow. According to Gouzenko's later memoir, This Was My Choice, their courtship had been brief, conducted during a period of extraordinary stress as the war continued and Moscow remained under threat. They had married in a civil ceremony with few guests, as was common during wartime. Within months of their marriage, Gouzenko had received orders that he was being posted abroad to serve in a Soviet diplomatic mission. The destination was Ottawa, Canada, where he would work in the cipher section of the Soviet embassy under the cover of being a civilian employee of the Soviet military attaché's office. The Gouzenkos, Igor, Anna, and their infant daughter, Evelyn, born in early 1943, arrived in Ottawa in June 1943, traveling via a circuitous route through Iran, India, and San Francisco that took more than 6 weeks. Ottawa in 1943 was a city transformed by war. Canada, as part of the British Commonwealth, had been at war since September 1939, and the capital reflected this reality with rationing, blackout precautions, and a vastly expanded government apparatus managing the war effort. The Soviet embassy, located on Charlotte Street in a residential neighborhood, was a modest three-story building that housed both diplomatic staff and intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover. Gouzenko's official position was as a cipher clerk in the office of Colonel Nikolai Zabotin, the Soviet military attaché. His actual function was to encode and decode communications between Moscow and the GRU's intelligence operations in Canada. The cipher section where Gouzenko worked was a secure room on the second floor of the embassy, protected by reinforced doors, special locks, and strict protocols governing who could enter and under what circumstances. Inside this room, Gouzenko and several other cipher clerks handled hundreds of telegrams each month, messages from Moscow containing instructions for intelligence officers in Canada, and messages from Canada to Moscow containing intelligence reports, agent assessments, and operational updates. The work was tedious and exacting. Soviet cipher systems in the 1940s involved multiple layers of encryption, with messages being encoded using one-time pads, sheets of paper containing random number groups that were used only once and then destroyed. Each message had to be encoded character by character, with the cipher clerk converting text into numbers, applying the one-time pad, and then transmitting the result via telegraph. Incoming messages reversed the process. Errors could render messages unintelligible or, worse, compromise the security of the cipher system. According to Gouzenko's testimony to the Royal Commission established after his defection, he typically worked 6 days per week, often for 10 or 12 hours per day, processing between 20 and 40 messages in an average shift. What made Gouzenko's position particularly sensitive was that he saw everything. Unlike field intelligence officers who handled individual agents and operations, Gouzenko processed communications relating to the entire GRU network in Canada. He knew the code names of agents. He knew what information they were providing. He knew their real identities in cases where those identities were referenced in communications from Moscow. He knew the priorities that Moscow assigned to different types of intelligence. He knew which Canadian officials were being targeted for recruitment. He knew which scientific and technical secrets the Soviet Union was seeking. Over the course of more than 2 years working in the cipher section, Gouzenko accumulated an extraordinary understanding of Soviet intelligence operations in North America. For much of his time in Ottawa, Gouzenko appeared to be a loyal Soviet citizen performing his duties conscientiously. He lived with his wife and daughter in a modest apartment on Somerset Street West. A son, Andrei, was born in Ottawa in 1944. He socialized primarily with other Soviet embassy staff, as was expected and required by embassy protocols that discouraged unnecessary contact with Canadians. He attended required political meetings and study sessions. He submitted to periodic security reviews. He gave no outward indication of dissatisfaction or disloyalty. But according to Gouzenko's memoir, "This Was My Choice," and his later testimony, his perspective began to change gradually during 1944 and early 1945. Several factors contributed to this shift, and understanding these motivations is essential to grasping why this particular defection occurred when and how it did. First, he and his wife were living in a Western society for the first time, and despite the restrictions placed on their movements and contacts, they could observe aspects of Canadian life that contrasted sharply with Soviet propaganda about capitalist societies. The standard of living for ordinary Canadians, even with wartime rationing, appeared higher than what they had experienced in Moscow. The freedom of movement, the variety of consumer goods available, the absence of the pervasive fear that characterized Soviet life, all of this made an impression, particularly on Anna, who was raising 2 young children and thinking about their futures. Second, Gouzenko was reading, day after day, intelligence reports and operational directives that revealed the extent of Soviet espionage activities in a country that was, officially, a wartime ally of the Soviet Union. Canada and the Soviet Union were both fighting Nazi Germany. Canadian soldiers were dying on European battlefields. Canadian factories were producing war materials, some of which were being shipped to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease arrangements. And yet the documents Gouzenko processed made clear that the Soviet Union was conducting extensive espionage operations aimed at stealing Canadian and Allied military secrets, recruiting Canadian citizens as agents, and penetrating Canadian government institutions. This contradiction, ally in public, adversary in secret, troubled him increasingly as he processed message after message detailing recruitment attempts, intelligence requirements, and operational successes. Third, and perhaps most significantly, Gouzenko learned in the spring of 1945 that his posting in Ottawa was scheduled to end. The Soviet embassy typically rotated staff every 2 or 3 years to reduce the risk of defection and to limit exposure to Western influences. Gouzenko received notification that he would be recalled to Moscow in the fall of 1945. For Gouzenko and his wife, who by 1945 had 2 young children, Evelyn, now 2 years old, and Andrei, an infant, the prospect of returning to the Soviet Union was increasingly unappealing. In Canada, they had experienced a level of material comfort and personal freedom that neither expected to find in post-war Moscow. Anna Gouzenko, in particular, expressed strong reluctance about returning, telling her husband, as he later recounted, that she wanted their children to grow up in Canada, not in the Soviet Union. Igor later described the decision to defect as one that crystallized over several months in mid-1945. He did not claim to have been motivated primarily by ideological opposition to communism, though he did express disillusionment with aspects of the Soviet system. Instead, he described his primary motivation as being the desire to remain in Canada with his family, to give his children opportunities they would not have in the Soviet Union, and, crucially, to have something valuable enough to offer Canadian authorities that they would grant asylum rather than returning his family to Soviet custody. The documents he possessed represented that value. Gouzenko understood that merely claiming Soviet espionage operations existed would be insufficient. Western intelligence services and governments suspected such operations existed, but suspicion was not proof. What Gouzenko had access to was proof: documentary evidence in Soviet official communications detailing who was being recruited, what information was being stolen, and how the operations were being conducted. But before that evening of September 5th would arrive, Gouzenko had spent 10 days carefully planning how to remove enough documents to prove his case without being detected during the removal process. The practical challenge was substantial. The cipher section operated under strict security protocols. All classified materials were supposed to remain in the secure room except when being transported under controlled conditions to other authorized locations. At the end of each shift, cipher clerks were required to return all documents to safes, which were then locked. Random security checks occasionally searched embassy staff to ensure no unauthorized materials were being removed. The risk of discovery was considerable, and discovery would mean not just failure to defect, but likely imprisonment or worse. Gouzenko began his preparations in late August 1945. Rather than attempting to remove a large quantity of documents at once, he adopted a gradual approach. Over approximately 10 days, from late August through early September, he would select several documents during his regular duties, place them in folders or among papers that he was legitimately allowed to take out of the secure room for temporary work purposes, and then either immediately conceal them on his person or temporarily hide them in other parts of the embassy building, where he could retrieve them later. By September 5th, 1945, he had accumulated documents in various locations, some in his desk, some in his apartment, some concealed in other parts of the embassy. The total would eventually be counted as 109 separate documents. On the evening of September 5, 1945, Gouzenko worked his regular shift in the cipher section. Colonel Zabatin and most senior embassy officials had left for the day. The cipher section had a reduced staff working evening hours to process any urgent communications. At approximately 7:15 p.m., Gouzenko gathered the final documents he needed, concealed them beneath his shirt, the documents creating a bulky mass that he attempted to minimize by distributing them around his torso, and walked out of the embassy building. He was not challenged or stopped. Embassy security at the time focused primarily on preventing unauthorized entry, not on searching departing Soviet employees who were assumed to be loyal. Gouzenko walked directly to his apartment at 511 Somerset Street West, approximately 15 minutes away. Anna was home with their 2 young children. According to later accounts in Gouzenko's memoir, Igor told her what he had done and showed her the documents spread across their small kitchen table. Anna's reaction was one of fear mixed with determination. She understood the implications, that they were now effectively fugitives from Soviet authority, that their lives depended on convincing Canadian authorities to grant them asylum, and that failure would likely result in their forced return to the Soviet Union and severe punishment. What happened over the next 2.5 days would become one of the more bizarre and troubling sequences in the history of Cold War defections, a period during which the Gouzenko family attempted repeatedly to convince Canadian authorities to take them seriously, only to be turned away or ignored multiple times before finally, desperately, finding someone willing to listen. On the morning of September 6, 1945, Igor Gouzenko left his apartment and walked to the offices of the Ottawa Journal, a major daily newspaper. He brought with him a selection of the documents he had taken from the embassy. His intention was to provide these documents to the newspaper, which would publish them and thereby make his defection public and irreversible. He met with an editor at the newspaper whose name was later recorded as Norton. According to Gouzenko's subsequent testimony to Canadian authorities, he attempted to explain that he had defected from the Soviet embassy and had documents proving Soviet espionage in Canada. The editor, Norton, was skeptical. He asked Gouzenko questions about why he was defecting, why he had come to a newspaper rather than to police or government authorities, and whether the documents were authentic. Gouzenko's English, while functional, was heavily accented and sometimes difficult to understand. Norton apparently concluded that Gouzenko might be mentally unstable or might be attempting some kind of provocation or fraud. He declined to accept the documents and told Gouzenko to contact government authorities if he had legitimate concerns about espionage. Gouzenko then went to the office of the Minister of Justice. The Minister of Justice in 1945 was Louis Saint Laurent, who would later become Prime Minister of Canada. However, Saint Laurent was not in Ottawa on September 6th. The staff member who met with Gouzenko listened to a brief explanation of why he was there, noted that this seemed to be a matter for police or external affairs rather than the Justice Ministry, and suggested Gouzenko contact those offices. No one took custody of the documents or offered Gouzenko any protection. Growing increasingly anxious, Gouzenko went to the offices of the Crown Attorney. Again, he attempted to explain that he had defected, that he had documents proving Soviet espionage, and that he needed protection. The response was similar to what he had received elsewhere, polite but non-committal, with suggestions that he should contact other authorities or return the next day when more senior officials would be available. By this point it was late afternoon on September 6th, and Gouzenko had been turned away or referred elsewhere by every authority he had approached. He returned to his apartment, where Anna was waiting with mounting fear. They had expected that once Igor presented documents proving Soviet espionage, Canadian authorities would immediately take them into protection. Instead, no one seemed to believe him or to understand the urgency of the situation. That evening, Gouzenko made one more attempt. He returned to the Ottawa Journal, this time speaking with a different editor named Chester Froude. Froude listened to Gouzenko's explanation and examined some of the documents. According to Froude's later statement to investigators, he could see that the documents appeared to be official Soviet communications with stamps and markings that looked authentic, but he could not read Russian and therefore could not verify their contents. Froude told Gouzenko that the newspaper could not accept the documents without authentication and suggested he contact the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who would have resources to verify what he was claiming. September 7, 1945, was a Friday. Gouzenko went to RCMP headquarters in Ottawa. At the reception desk, he again attempted to explain that he had defected from the Soviet embassy with documents proving espionage. The officer at the desk told him that matters involving foreign embassies and espionage were outside the RCMP's jurisdiction and should be handled by the Department of External Affairs. He was given an address for External Affairs and told to go there. Gouzenko went to the Department of External Affairs. It was late in the afternoon on a Friday, and most senior officials had left for the weekend. The staff member he spoke with listened briefly and told Gouzenko that such matters could not be addressed without consultations with senior officials who would not be available until Monday. Gouzenko was told to return on Monday, September 10th. By Friday evening, September 7th, Gouzenko had been trying for 2 full days to convince Canadian authorities to take him seriously. He had been turned away by a newspaper, by the Justice Ministry, by the Crown Attorney's Office, by the RCMP, and by External Affairs. He had documents that he believed proved an extensive Soviet espionage network, but no one would take custody of them or offer him protection. Meanwhile, he had not reported to work at the Soviet embassy since Wednesday evening. His absence would have been noticed. Soviet officials would be looking for him. Gouzenko and his wife spent Friday night in their apartment, terrified that Soviet embassy officials would come for them. According to later accounts provided to RCMP investigators, they barely slept. Igor sat by the window watching the street for any sign of Soviet personnel. They discussed what they would do if embassy officials came to the door, whether Igor should attempt to escape out the back while Anna remained with the children, whether they should simply open the door and surrender, whether they should barricade themselves inside. Anna held Andrei, just months old, while Evelyn slept fitfully in the next room, sensing her parents' fear. On Saturday morning, September 8th, their worst fears materialized. At approximately 8:30 a.m., there was a knock at the apartment door. Through the peephole, Igor could see 2 men he recognized as Soviet embassy officials, not diplomats, but security personnel. The men knocked repeatedly and called out in Russian, saying they knew Gouzenko was inside and that he needed to open the door and return to the embassy to discuss his absence from work. Gouzenko did not open the door. The knocking continued for several minutes, then stopped. The 2 men left. But Gouzenko understood this would not be the end of it. Soviet officials now knew where he was and would return, possibly with reinforcements and with approval from more senior officials to take more forceful action. In desperation, Gouzenko and his wife decided to seek help from their neighbors. The apartment building was a modest multi-unit structure with several other families living on the same floor. The Gouzenkos had limited interaction with these neighbors, but Anna went to the apartment directly across the hall and knocked on the door. The family living there was named Elliot, a middle-aged couple with adult children. Anna Gouzenko, speaking her limited English, attempted to explain that she and her husband were in danger, that people from the Soviet embassy were trying to force them to return, and that they needed help. Mrs. Elliot, who answered the door, was initially confused and skeptical, but Anna's visible fear was convincing. She was holding her infant son, and her hands were shaking. Mrs. Elliot agreed to let Anna and the two children stay in their apartment temporarily while the situation was addressed. Igor remained in his own apartment with the documents, still hoping that he could make contact with Canadian authorities who would finally take action. At approximately 11 a.m. on Saturday, September 8th, the Soviet embassy officials returned. This time there were 4 of them, including 2 more senior diplomatic staff. They knocked loudly on Gouzenko's apartment door, and when he did not respond, they began discussing in Russian, loud enough that Gouzenko could hear through the door, what actions they should take. According to Gouzenko's later testimony to the Royal Commission, he heard them say that they had authorization to enter the apartment by force, if necessary, to retrieve embassy property that had been stolen. Mrs. Elliot, hearing the commotion from across the hall, called the Ottawa police. At approximately 11:20 a.m., 2 constables from the Ottawa police arrived at the apartment building. They found 4 men from the Soviet embassy standing outside Gouzenko's apartment door. Through the Elliots, who explained what they understood of the situation, the police learned that the man inside the apartment claimed to have defected from the Soviet embassy. This created a jurisdictional dilemma. The Soviet officials claimed that Gouzenko was still a Soviet citizen and an embassy employee who had stolen embassy property and needed to be returned to embassy custody. Gouzenko, speaking through the door, claimed that he had defected and that the Soviet officials were trying to force him to return against his will. The Ottawa police constables had no clear guidance on how to handle a defection from a foreign embassy. After approximately 30 minutes of confused discussion, the police told the Soviet officials that they could not force entry into a private residence without a warrant, and that the matter would need be resolved through proper legal channels. The Soviet officials eventually left, but made clear they would be returning with whatever authorization was necessary. The Ottawa police contacted their superiors to report the situation. The report eventually reached senior officials in the Ottawa Police Service and, through them, the RCMP. Late on Saturday afternoon, RCMP Inspector William Hunt arrived at Gouzenko's apartment building. Hunt had been briefed on what had transpired, that a Soviet embassy employee claimed to have defected with documents proving espionage, that he had been trying for 2 days to get Canadian authorities to take him seriously, and that Soviet officials were attempting to force his return to the embassy. Hunt spoke with Gouzenko through the apartment door. In halting English, Gouzenko explained what he had done and what the documents contained. Hunt asked Gouzenko to show him some of the documents. Gouzenko passed several pages under the door. Hunt could see they appeared to be official Soviet communications with stamps and letterhead and cipher notations. He could not read Russian, but the documents looked authentic. Hunt made the decision to take Gouzenko into protective custody. At approximately 6 p.m. on Saturday, September 8th, nearly 3 full days after Gouzenko had walked out of the Soviet embassy with the documents, he was finally provided protection by Canadian authorities. Hunt arranged for Gouzenko, Anna, and their 2 children to be taken to a secure RCMP facility outside Ottawa. The documents were placed in RCMP custody. Guards were posted at the facility where the Gouzenkos were staying. Over the weekend of September 9th to 10th, Russian-language translators working for Canadian intelligence services examined the documents. What they revealed was explosive. The materials included cipher telegrams between Moscow and the GRU station in Ottawa, Instruction directives from Moscow specifying intelligence requirements, agent reports detailing information being collected, operational assessments discussing recruitment successes and failures, and organizational materials outlining the structure of the GRU network in Canada. Collectively, these documents painted a comprehensive picture of Soviet espionage operations that included more than 20 Canadian agents operating in government, military, scientific research, and other sensitive positions. Codenames appeared repeatedly in the communications: Alec, Badeau, Bagley, Debooz, Ernst, Gallia, Gray, Green, Genie, Prometheus, and others. Many of the communications included sufficient detail that investigators could begin identifying who these code names referred to. One agent, codenamed Alec, was described in the documents as having provided information about atomic research conducted at a facility in Montreal. Canadian authorities quickly determined that Alec was Alan Nunn May, a British physicist who had been working at the Montreal Laboratory, a Canadian facility conducting atomic research as part of the Allied effort to develop nuclear weapons. Another agent, codenamed Ernst, was identified from the documents as a member of the Canadian Parliament who had been providing political intelligence and facilitating recruitment of other agents. Investigators determined that Ernst was Fred Rose, a prominent communist and labor organizer representing a Montreal constituency. Other documents detailed efforts to recruit additional agents, including attempts to target Canadian government officials, military personnel, and scientists. The materials revealed the organizational structure of the GRU operation in Canada, including the role of Colonel Zabotin as the Chief of Intelligence Operations, and identified other Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover at the embassy. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King was briefed on the situation on Monday, September 10th. King, who had led Canada through the war years and was deeply concerned about post-war relations with both the Soviet Union and the United States, understood immediately that the Gouzenko defection represented a major diplomatic and intelligence crisis. The Soviet Union was still, officially, an ally of Canada. The war in Europe had ended only 4 months earlier. The war in the Pacific was still ongoing. Japan had surrendered just 3 weeks earlier, on August 15th, but the formal surrender ceremony had only occurred on September 2nd. Relations between the Soviet Union and its Western allies were already showing signs of strain, but open conflict had not yet emerged. King worried that handling the Gouzenko case poorly could precipitate a serious diplomatic breach. For several weeks, King's government attempted to manage the situation quietly. Gouzenko and his family remained in RCMP protective custody. Intelligence analysts continued examining the documents in detail. British and American intelligence services were briefed on what had been discovered, as many of the intelligence targets and some of the agents identified in the documents involved British or American interests. But no public announcement was made, and no arrests were carried out. King hoped that a discreet approach might limit the diplomatic fallout and allow for quiet diplomatic resolution. This discretion ended abruptly on February 3, 1946, when the American radio commentator Drew Pearson publicly reported that a Soviet spy ring had been exposed in Canada following the defection of a Soviet embassy official. Pearson had learned about the case from American intelligence sources who had been briefed by the Canadians. Once the story was public, King's government could no longer maintain silence. On February 15, 1946, more than 5 months after Gouzenko's defection, the Canadian government publicly announced the establishment of a royal commission to investigate espionage activities in Canada. The Royal Commission, headed by 2 Supreme Court justices, Robert Taschereau and R.L. Kellogg, was given broad powers to investigate, subpoena witnesses, and examine evidence. The announcement stated that information had been received from a Soviet embassy employee regarding espionage activities and that the government was taking the matter seriously. The Soviet Union responded with outrage. Ambassador Georgy Zarubin issued a statement claiming that the charges were fabrications, that Gouzenko was a criminal and a traitor who had stolen money from the embassy, and that Canada was damaging relations by giving credence to his lies. Moscow demanded Gouzenko be returned to Soviet custody to face charges. Canada refused. Over the following weeks, the RCMP, working with the Royal Commission, and began arresting individuals identified in Gouzenko's documents. The arrests proceeded carefully, as Canadian authorities wanted to build solid legal cases that would result in convictions. Between February and March 1946, more than 30 people were arrested and questioned, with 18 ultimately charged with various offenses related to espionage, conspiracy, and violations of the Official Secrets Act. Among the arrests, Alan Nunn May stood out as most prominent. The British physicist identified as Alec was arrested in London by British authorities in February 1946 and charged under the Official Secrets Act. In April 1946, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. His confession, given to British interrogators, confirmed that he had provided the Soviets with samples of uranium-235 and uranium-233, along with detailed technical information about atomic research being conducted in Canada and the United States. May's espionage represented one of the earliest known cases of atomic secrets being passed to the Soviet Union, and his arrest sent shockwaves through the Western scientific community. Fred Rose, the member of Parliament identified as Ernst, was arrested in March 1946. His case was politically explosive, as it marked the first time in Canadian history that a sitting member of Parliament had been charged with espionage. Rose was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 6 years in prison. He served his sentence and was released in 1951, after which he moved to Poland and lived there until his death in 1983. Other arrests included Emma Woykin, a cipher clerk in the cipher division of the Department of External Affairs who had passed classified communications to Soviet handlers, David Sugar, a scientist who had provided technical information, Raymond Boyer, a chemist who had passed information about explosives research, and Samuel Carr, who had served as a courier and organizer for the spy network. Trials proceeded through 1946 and into 1947, resulting in convictions in most cases, though several individuals were acquitted or had charges dropped due to insufficient evidence admissible in court. The Gouzenko defection and the subsequent exposures had effects that extended far beyond Canada. In the United States, the revelations contributed to growing concerns about Soviet espionage and communist infiltration of government institutions. The House Un-American Activities Committee intensified its investigations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation expanded its counterintelligence operations. The case provided ammunition for politicians who argued that the Soviet Union could not be trusted and that communist sympathizers posed a genuine security threat to Western democracies. In Britain, the May case prompted a comprehensive review of security procedures in scientific and military research establishments. It contributed to suspicions that there might be other Soviet agents operating within British institutions, suspicions that would be confirmed in subsequent years with the exposure of the Cambridge 5 spy ring, Kim Philby, Donald MacLean, Guy Burgess, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross, all of whom had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1930s and had penetrated British intelligence services at the highest levels. The Gouzenko case also had a direct impact on the development of Soviet-Western relations in the early Cold War period. The defection occurred at a moment when the wartime alliance was fraying, but had not yet completely broken down. The evidence Gouzenko provided of extensive Soviet espionage operations against its wartime allies accelerated the deterioration of trust and contributed to the hardening of positions that would characterize the Cold War. In the United States, the case reinforced arguments made by diplomatic officials like George Kennan, who advocated for a policy of containment toward Soviet expansionism. In Moscow, the exposure of the GRU networks in Canada and the subsequent arrests and trials confirmed Soviet leaders' suspicions that the West would be hostile and that the post-war period would be characterized by conflict rather than cooperation. For Igor Gouzenko and his family, the immediate years following the defection were marked by intense security concerns and significant disruption. The Soviet Union had demonstrated a willingness to conduct operations to eliminate defectors, and Canadian authorities took seriously the possibility that assassins might be sent to kill Gouzenko. The family was kept under constant RCMP protection. They were relocated multiple times, never remaining in one place long enough for their location to become known. Igor was required to testify before the Royal Commission, but did so behind a screen to protect his identity. Photographs of him were never released, and when he did eventually make rare public appearances years later, he wore a hood over his head to conceal his face. For Anna Gouzenko, the reality of their new life became clear in the weeks and months following the defection. She had agreed to stay in Canada, had supported her husband's decision, but now she found herself trapped in a strange existence that would last the rest of her life. She was a prisoner of protection, unable to contact anyone from her past, unable to make friends freely, unable to live openly. She had to raise 2 young children and eventually additional children born in Canada in the late 1940s under conditions of constant vigilance and isolation. Anna's daily life became a careful choreography of security measures. When she took the children to a park, RCMP officers watched from a distance. When she went grocery shopping, she used an assumed name and paid in cash to avoid creating records. When neighbors asked friendly questions about where the family was from or what Igor did for work, she had to offer vague, rehearsed answers that revealed nothing. The children could not invite friends over to play. Birthday parties were small, private affairs with only family present. School enrollment required using their assumed surnames, and the children had to be carefully coached never to mention their real family name or their father's past. According to interviews given by family acquaintances years later to researchers studying the Gouzenko case, Anna bore the psychological burden of this existence with remarkable strength, but also with visible strain. She became intensely protective of the children, sometimes to the point of appearing over-controlling to outsiders who did not understand the reasons. She rarely smiled in the few photographs taken of the family over the years. She aged quickly, her face showing stress lines and weariness that seemed disproportionate to her years. The children, Evelyn and Andre, and the younger siblings born later, grew up with an understanding that their family was different, though they did not fully comprehend why until they were older. Evelyn later recalled, in a rare interview given to a researcher in the 1980s, that she knew from an early age that her father had done something important and dangerous, and that this meant the family had to be careful. She remembered being told never to tell anyone at school what her father's real name was, never to mention that they had once lived in the Soviet Union, never to talk about the guards who sometimes watched their house. She remembered understanding, even as a young child, that breaking these rules could result in something terrible happening, though what that terrible thing might be was never explained in terms she could fully grasp. Andre, younger and with even fewer memories of the early years, struggled more with the family's situation as he grew older. According to school records later examined by researchers, he had behavioral issues in adolescence, including conflicts with authority figures and difficulty maintaining friendships. Psychologists who evaluated him during this period noted signs of identity confusion and anger related to the circumstances of his childhood. He eventually found stability in adulthood, but the path was difficult. As the immediate danger to Gouzenko's life likely diminished through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the Soviet Union's priorities shifted, and the resources devoted to tracking and eliminating defectors from the 1940s were no longer being allocated in the same way. The family nevertheless maintained their security precautions. Igor attempted to build a life despite these constraints. He learned English more fluently over time, and in the late 1940s he began working as a writer. In 1948, he published a novel titled This Was My Choice, an autobiographical account of his defection and his experiences in the Soviet Union. The book was published under his own name, though he remained physically concealed from the public. The novel was moderately successful and was translated into several languages, providing the family with income and giving Igor a sense of purpose beyond his role as a protected witness. In 1954, he published a second novel, The Fall of a Titan, a fictional account of Soviet political intrigue that drew heavily on his knowledge of the Soviet system. This novel won the Governor-General's Award, one of Canada's most prestigious literary prizes, though he could not attend the award ceremony in person due to security concerns. One of the few public appearances Gouzenko made occurred in 1954, shortly after winning the Governor-General's Award. He agreed to appear on a Canadian television program to discuss his writing and his defection. The appearance was carefully orchestrated. He sat in a chair with his back to the camera, his head covered by a white pillowcase with eye holes cut out so he could see. His voice was disguised electronically. The image of this hooded figure discussing his decision to betray the Soviet Union became one of the iconic images of Cold War Canada, symbolizing both the reality of Soviet espionage and the bizarre measures necessary to protect those who exposed it. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s, he occasionally provided statements or testimony related to espionage cases or Cold War issues. He testified in writing or through intermediaries in several espionage trials. He was consulted by Western intelligence agencies about Soviet intelligence methods and organizational structures. He provided assessments of whether particular individuals might be Soviet agents, though these assessments were not always reliable, and in some cases he made accusations that were later determined to be unfounded, contributing to unjustified suspicions against innocent people and adding to the climate of paranoia that characterized the era. The broader impact of Gouzenko's defection on Western intelligence and security services continued to reverberate for decades. The case established protocols for how defectors should be handled, protocols that included immediate protective custody, debriefing by intelligence professionals, careful validation of information provided, and long-term security measures to protect defectors and their families. It demonstrated the intelligence value that could be gained from individuals who worked in cipher or communications roles, as they had access to information across entire networks rather than just individual operations. It also highlighted the challenges of managing defector cases, particularly the difficulties that had emerged during Gouzenko's initial attempts to defect when no Canadian authorities initially took him seriously, leading to reforms in how such approaches were handled in the future. The case also contributed to the development of what would become a pervasive culture of suspicion and security consciousness in government and military institutions throughout the Cold War period. Background checks became more thorough. Security clearance procedures became more rigorous. Polygraph testing was introduced for individuals in sensitive positions. Restrictions were placed on international travel by personnel with access to classified information. Monitoring and surveillance of individuals who had access to sensitive material became routine. While these measures were intended to prevent espionage, they also created environments of suspicion and fear that sometimes caught innocent people in their nets, and that limited open intellectual exchange even in legitimate contexts. For the Soviet Union, the Gouzenko defection represented a significant intelligence failure and a major embarrassment. The exposure of the GRU networks in Canada and the arrests of numerous agents represented a substantial loss of intelligence capability. It forced Soviet intelligence services to reassess their operational security and to recognize that cipher clerks and communications personnel, despite being considered secure because of their indoctrination and supervision, could nevertheless become defectors if sufficiently motivated. The case likely contributed to even more stringent security measures within Soviet intelligence organizations, including more intensive surveillance of personnel serving abroad, more frequent rotations to prevent individuals from becoming too comfortable in Western societies, and enhanced efforts to ensure that family members of intelligence personnel stationed abroad remained in the Soviet Union as de facto hostages to ensure loyalty. The question of what impact the Gouzenko documents had on the actual course of the Cold War is difficult to answer definitively. On one level, the impact was significant. The defection exposed a major intelligence network, led to arrests and trials, damaged Soviet intelligence capabilities in North America, and contributed to the deteriorating relations between the Soviet Union and the West. The case provided evidence that validated concerns about Soviet espionage and influenced policy decisions in Western capitals, particularly regarding atomic energy security and classified research protection. On another level, the specific intelligence effects may have been less dramatic than initially appeared. The intelligence that had been provided to the Soviets by the agents in the Canadian network likely did influence Soviet military research and development to some degree, particularly regarding atomic weapons development, but the extent of that influence remains classified and debated. The Soviet Union would have eventually developed nuclear weapons, advanced radar systems, and other military technologies regardless of what they learned from espionage, though espionage may have accelerated their progress by several years. The agents who were arrested represented a setback for Soviet intelligence, but Soviet intelligence services quickly rebuilt their networks using different methods and different personnel. Igor Gouzenko died on June 28, 1982, at the age of 63. The cause of death was reported as a heart attack. He died at his home, the location of which was not disclosed publicly. His death was announced by the Canadian government, which issued a brief statement acknowledging his passing and noting his role in exposing Soviet espionage in 1945. Canadian media outlets carried obituaries that summarized his defection and its historical significance, though even in death, no photographs of his face were published except for one official identification photo from the 1940s that had been taken shortly after his defection. Anna Gouzenko outlived her husband by 19 years. She continued to live under her assumed identity, maintaining the security protocols that had governed their lives since 1945. She rarely spoke to anyone outside her immediate family about her experiences. She declined all requests for interviews. She lived quietly, supported by a small pension from the Canadian government and by the residuals from her husband's books. By the time of her death in 2001 at the age of 82, the Cold War had ended more than a decade earlier, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and the geopolitical context that had made her husband's defection significant had been transformed almost beyond recognition. Yet even in the post-Cold War world, the family maintained their privacy and their security consciousness, suggesting that the psychological impact of living as perpetual targets had become a permanent aspect of their identity. The children of Igor and Anna Gouzenko, Evelyn, Andrei, and the additional children born in Canada have maintained near total privacy. Their real names, their locations, their occupations, and most details of their lives remain unknown to the public. This privacy is both a choice and a continuation of security measures that began when they were children. They grew up as probably the most thoroughly concealed family in Canadian history, and that concealment has persisted across generations. The ethical questions raised by the Gouzenko case are complex and do not admit of simple answers. Was Gouzenko heroic for exposing Soviet espionage, or was he a traitor who betrayed his country for personal advantage? Were the Canadian, British, and American governments justified in using the case to expand surveillance and security measures that infringed on civil liberties? Or did they overreact and create a climate of fear that harmed innocent people? Were the Soviet agents who passed secrets to the USSR motivated by conscience and principle, or were they simply traitors who deserved punishment? Were the sentences imposed on convicted agents proportionate to their crimes, or were they excessive? From one perspective, Gouzenko made a courageous choice to expose a network of espionage that violated the sovereignty of his host country and that involved stealing military secrets during and immediately after a world war. He risked his life and the safety of his family to provide information that Western governments needed to protect their security. He spent the rest of his life under threat because he had done what he believed was right. This perspective treats Gouzenko as a hero and treats the Soviet agents as criminals who deserved punishment. From another perspective, Gouzenko was a Soviet intelligence officer who betrayed his oath, his country, and his colleagues for personal advantage, specifically to avoid returning to the Soviet Union and to secure a comfortable life in the West. The agents he exposed were in many cases individuals who believed they were contributing to a more just world order, preventing Western military dominance, and helping the Soviet Union defend itself against hostile powers. The trials and imprisonments that followed destroyed lives and families based on actions that, from the agents' perspective, were acts of conscience. This perspective views Gouzenko more critically and views at least some of the exposed agents with more sympathy. The reality, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere between these extremes. The agents he exposed had varying motivations. Some were committed ideologues, some were naive idealists who did not fully understand what they were doing, some were motivated primarily by money, and some may have been coerced or manipulated. The Canadian government's response was driven both by legitimate security concerns and by political pressures to be seen as tough on communism. The sentences imposed on convicted agents reflected both the seriousness of espionage offenses and the political climate of the time, which demanded harsh punishment for communist sympathizers. What is certain is that the Gouzenko case created victims beyond those directly involved. Anna Gouzenko and her children lost their homeland, their identity, and their freedom to live normal lives. The families of convicted agents, wives, husbands, children, parents, suffered shame, economic hardship, and social stigma for actions they had no part in and often did not even know about. The broader Canadian public experienced an increase in surveillance, security scrutiny, and suspicion that affected civil liberties and created a climate of fear that lasted for decades. The case also established patterns that would repeat throughout the Cold War. Defectors would continue to emerge from Soviet intelligence services, bringing documents and information that exposed spy networks. Trials and imprisonments would follow. Security services would expand. Political leaders would use espionage cases to justify broader policies of containment and confrontation. And families would be destroyed, both the families of defectors, who lived in perpetual hiding, and the families of exposed agents who faced imprisonment and disgrace. Igor Gouzenko walked out of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa on September 5, 1945, with documents hidden under his shirt. He was 26 years old, married with 2 young children, employed as a cipher clerk, living in a rented apartment in a city where he had been for just over 2 years. Within days, his life had been permanently transformed. He would never return to the Soviet Union. He would never see his parents or siblings again. He would spend the rest of his life concealed, protected, isolated, and defined by a single decision made in the evening of a September day. The documents themselves, pages of ciphertext, operational directives, agent reports, were paper and ink, inanimate objects, but they carried information that would lead to arrests, trials, imprisonments, and the reshaping of Cold War security policies. They would influence the development of counterintelligence procedures. They would contribute to the breakdown of the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the West. They would be studied by intelligence analysts for decades, used in training programs, and eventually deposited in archives where historians would examine them. But documents, like photographs, can only capture certain kinds of information. They cannot capture the terror of a family hiding in an apartment while embassy officials pound on the door. They cannot capture the experience of children growing up unable to tell anyone their real names. They cannot capture the despair of a convicted agent facing years in prison while his family struggles to survive without him. They cannot capture the moral calculus that leads an individual to decide that betraying his country is the right thing to do. They cannot capture the regrets that come in the years afterward when it becomes clear that the choice, whatever it was, has costs that were not fully anticipated. Igor Gouzenko was 26 when he defected. He was 63 when he died, having lived for 37 years in Canada under constant security protection. In that time, the Cold War intensified, reached its peak, began to thaw, intensified again, and began its final decline. The Soviet Union that he had defected from remained in power for 9 more years after his death, finally collapsing in 1991. The GRU organization he had worked for continues to exist in Russia today, though operating in a fundamentally different geopolitical context. The question that perhaps cannot be answered is whether Gouzenko's defection and the exposure of the spy networks his documents revealed actually made the world safer, or simply contributed to decades of suspicion, confrontation, and proxy conflicts that defined the Cold War. Security services would argue that detecting and disrupting espionage networks is essential to national defense. Critics would argue that the paranoia and surveillance culture that the case helped establish did as much harm as the espionage itself. What can be said with certainty is that the human cost was real and substantial. Igor Gouzenko gave up his homeland, his identity, and his freedom to live normally. Anna Gouzenko lived in hiding and fear for more than 50 years. Their children grew up in isolation. The convicted agents lost years of their lives to imprisonment. Their families suffered shame and hardship. And beyond these immediate victims, thousands or millions of others lived in a world shaped by increased surveillance, suspicion, and fear, a world in which the possibility of betrayal was always present, in which loyalty was constantly tested, and in which the distinction between friend and enemy was never entirely clear. The documents sit now in archival boxes, available to researchers with appropriate permissions. They are historical artifacts, evidence of a particular moment in time when one man made a choice that rippled outward to affect the lives of hundreds of people directly and the course of history more broadly. They are, in the end, just documents, paper, ink, ciphertext, operational instructions, but they are also monuments to the human capacity for courage, betrayal, fear, conviction, and consequences that exceed anything anticipated when a 26-year-old cipher clerk walked out of an embassy on a September evening with stolen secrets concealed beneath his shirt.